In early 2024, New York City quietly signed a contract that made almost no sense on paper. The city hired one of the world's most prestigious consulting firms to help solve a problem so ordinary it felt like satire: how to put trash into bins. The firm responded with an 80-page presentation filled with branded diagrams and corporate buzzwords, all leading to a recommendation that boiled down to a single idea: use containers. It was billed as innovative, strategic, forward-thinking. It also cost taxpayers $4 million. On its own, the story is a curiosity. A city overwhelmed by everyday issues turns to a global powerhouse, better known for billion-dollar corporate restructurings. But the price tag, the jargon, and the apparent triviality of the advice reveal something deeper.
They've been called the watchdogs of capitalism, the conscience of the free market, and the pinstripe mafia. The Big Four auditors: Ernst & Young, KPMG, PwC, and...
For decades, the consulting industry has lived on the boundary between expertise and illusion, selling guidance that can be brilliant, necessary, or at times, shockingly obvious. Yet this wasn't always the case. There was a time when consultants were brought in because companies simply couldn't function without them. And for a while, the industry earned its influence. But somewhere along the way, the balance shifted. The brand became the product. The slide deck mattered more than the solution. And now, after years of unquestioned authority, the entire model is beginning to unravel. Behind the $4 million trash bin is a larger question. How did one of the most prestigious industries in the world reach a point where its value is being challenged not by competitors, but by the very tools it once used to justify its existence? That story begins long before AI, layoffs, or viral headlines, back when consulting actually solved real problems. In the 1990s, American businesses were expanding faster than they could understand themselves. Deregulation swept through the economy with near-religious enthusiasm, stripping away guardrails that had long kept industries contained. Companies were suddenly free to merge, acquire, and sprawl into territories they had never touched before. And they did, aggressively. Within a decade, the annual value of mergers and acquisition jumped from a few $100 billion to more than $1.7 trillion. Corporate empires fused almost overnight. On paper, this created stronger firms. In practice, it produced chaos, duplicated departments, conflicting systems, clashing cultures, and organizational structures so tangled that even executives couldn't explain how their companies worked. This was the environment where consulting earned its reputation. Businesses didn't just want outside help, they needed it. Firms like McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group became specialists in post-merger triage. They mapped what existed inside newly merged companies, identified redundancies, and determined which functions were essential for the combined organization to survive. At a time when corporations relied on outdated processes and little analytical rigor, consultants introduced methodologies executives had never used before. The value was real. Removing overlapping departments without crippling a company required judgment, data, and detachment internal teams couldn't maintain. Consultants offered exactly that, a structured way to turn disorder into something resembling strategy. By the late 1990s, consulting had become a fixture in boardrooms and a default response to corporate confusion. But the boom that made it indispensable was never built to last. And when it ended, the industry faced a reckoning that forced it to reinvent itself entirely, each sector sober. The consulting boom of the 1990s didn't collapse because companies stopped needing advice. It collapsed because the environment that made consulting essential was swept away almost overnight. The trigger was a series of corporate scandals, most famously Enron, that shook public confidence in American business to its core. Enron didn't just fail, it imploded in a way that revealed how deeply flawed the era's corporate practices had become.
To become not only the world's largest energy trader, but the world's seventh largest company overall. At its peak in the year 2000, Enron was officially pulling in more revenue than IBM, Disney, and Bank of America combined. By the time it filed for Chapter 11 protection in 2001, though, its shares were worth pennies.
Creative accounting, opaque financial structures, and unchecked expansion wiped out more than $60 billion in shareholder value. And Enron wasn't alone. A wave of scandals involving household names made it clear corporate America had pushed deregulation far beyond what the system could handle. The political response was immediate. In the early 2000s, regulations returned with force, reintroducing oversight and constraints that had largely disappeared in the previous decade. Measures aimed at restoring accountability had an unintended consequence. They brought the wild rush of mergers and acquisitions to a halt, and with that, consulting's golden pipeline dried up. The industry had grown dependent on the churn of corporate mergers, the restructurings, integrations, and cost-cutting that followed. When that activity slowed, demand for consultants contracted sharply. Firms that had been expanding at breakneck speed were suddenly shrinking. Revenues fell, projects vanished. At one point, the industry lost nearly 2/3 of its value. It was consulting's first major identity crisis. The model that built the industry no longer fit the new environment. Consulting firms could fade into irrelevance or find a new source of demand. They chose the latter, setting the industry on a path that shifted it from problem solving to something increasingly held together by image, jargon, and the illusion of expertise. That shift began with a surprising new customer, the government. When the merger pipeline dried up, consulting firms didn't disappear, they adapted. But the pivot they chose fundamentally altered their incentives. Instead of focusing on corporations wrestling with integration and efficiency, they began selling their services to governments, sprawling institutions with complex bureaucracies, enormous budgets, and a chronic shortage of internal expertise. On paper, this shift made sense. By the early 2000s, government agencies were growing rapidly, taking on more responsibilities without proportionally expanding their technical or managerial capacity. Public sector processes were slow, outdated, and fragmented across departments. Officials believed consultants could bring private sector discipline into the public sphere. For consulting firms, this was the perfect opportunity. Public contracts were steady, large, and most importantly, safe. Accountability was diffuse. There was rarely a single executive to blame if a project stalled or collapsed. Firms could take on massive assignments with minimal reputational risk. The effects were immediate. Federal spending on consultants tripled within a few years. Major firms built entire divisions for public sector strategy, digital modernization, and administrative reform. It looked like a natural evolution, but beneath the surface, something fundamental was changing. Government work offered insulation, deliverables defined by pages, not outcomes, timelines stretching for years, metrics vague or absent. And when projects failed, as they increasingly did, no one faced clear consequences. The clearest example came in 2012, when the U.S. Air Force canceled the Expeditionary Combat Support System after nearly a decade and more than $1 billion spent, much of it on consultants. The system delivered nothing, yet no firm faced meaningful repercussions. The industry absorbed a quiet lesson. In government work, failure didn't damage the model, it sustained it. Consulting became less about solving problems and more about selling the appearance of progress, reinforced by a new corporate dialect that looked strategic and said little. As consulting firms embedded themselves deeper into government agencies and global corporations, something subtle but important changed in the way they communicated. The industry drifted from concrete analysis toward an abstract, stylized language, an expanding vocabulary of alignment, synergy, value creation, and strategic transformation, words that sounded authoritative but conveyed almost nothing specific. This shift was intentional. In an environment where success was hard to measure and accountability was diffuse, clarity became a liability. Vague language protected firms from blame, softened expectations, and made even simple recommendations sound sophisticated. Streamlining operations became optimizing organizational bandwidth. Cleaning streets became urban containerization. The packaging mattered as much as the substance, and the packaging was lucrative. Firms perfected deliverables that projected expertise, color-coded matrices, complex frameworks, and slide decks polished to perfection. PowerPoint became not just a tool, but the product. This aesthetic of expertise fueled an illusion of prestige. Executives hired consultants not only for advice, but for what their presence signaled: seriousness, diligence, and cover for difficult decisions. When layoffs loomed, consultants offered justification. When mergers stalled, they supplied rationale. Even when leaders already knew their preferred direction, consultants transformed it into an evidence-based strategy. For a time, the illusion held. Prestigious firms became magnets for elite graduates from Ivy League universities and global business schools, promising rigor, validation, and proximity to high-level decision-making. But the model had a flaw. Prestige can amplify value, not replace it. As consulting leaned on image and language, clients began noticing that many expensive recommendations weren't solving much. Small cracks appeared. As trust slipped and outcomes stagnated, a model built on perception as much as performance began to wobble. It wouldn't stay hidden for long. By the early 2020s, the consulting industry was still projecting confidence, but the foundation beneath it had weakened. Clients were no longer easily impressed by sleek frameworks or glossy presentations. After years of hiring consultants for everything from restructuring to innovation strategy, many executives quietly admitted they weren't seeing the returns they once assumed were there. The data confirmed it. Surveys showed only a small fraction of businesses believed consultants were delivering more good than harm. The erosion of confidence grew from accumulated experiences, projects that dragged on, recommendations that felt generic, and transformation plans that left organizations largely unchanged. Inside firms, the shift was unmistakable. Growth that had once been automatic began to stall. Utilization rates dropped. Teams long operating at full capacity found themselves between projects. As revenue slipped, even the industry's most prestigious firms began doing something they rarely acknowledged: cutting staff. These weren't minor trims. Entire divisions were downsized. Thousands of consultants were laid off across major firms in under 2 years. The message was clear. Even the giants were struggling to justify their scale. For an industry built on prestige, this was more than financial pressure. Consulting's power depended on the belief that these firms possessed unique insight and unmatched talent. Layoffs disrupted that image. If the work was indispensable, why were so many experts expendable? Inside the firms, culture shifted. Analysts and associate roles felt less like elite springboards and more like demanding jobs with unclear payoff. Younger employees saw fewer prospects and more repetitive work. What changed wasn't just the environment, it was the perception of value. Consulting had expanded into every corner of business and government, offering advice on increasingly abstract problems. As clients grew more sophisticated, the gap between promises and outcomes became harder to ignore. And the deepest disruption was still ahead, arriving in the form of a technology consultants once believed they could harness to restore their influence. When artificial intelligence entered the mainstream, consulting firms saw it as their chance to reinvent themselves. After years of sliding trust and stagnant demand, AI seemed the perfect lifeline, complex enough to intimidate executives, promising enough to justify new budgets, and disruptive enough to position consultants as indispensable guides through a technological revolution. But the industry misread the moment. For decades, much consulting work relied on labor-intensive tasks: collecting data, synthesizing interviews, cleaning spreadsheets, building market models, drafting memos, and assembling slide decks. Firms billed these at premium rates justified by analyst talent. Yet this work was exactly the kind of structured, pattern-based analysis that modern AI could replicate in minutes.
It's been revealed Deloitte used artificial intelligence to prepare a report to the federal government's Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. The department spent $440,000 on this report, which contained errors and a made-up quote from a federal court judge.
For the first time, clients could see behind the curtain. Tools available to any manager could summarize research, compare markets, analyze trends, or generate strategic options. Tasks once required in a small army of consultants. Executives began asking, do we need consultants at all? Firms tried to pivot into AE implementation, launching practices, branded tools, and digital transformation pitches. But the gap between confidence and technical depth became clear. High-profile failures piled up. AI systems misclassified data, hallucinated results, or produced contradictory recommendations. Some agencies banned generative AI entirely. These failures exposed a structural weakness. Firms were selling expertise they didn't possess. Meanwhile, a significant share of consulting tasks was now automatable. Core services, analysis, forecasting, recommendation building were exactly where AI excelled. Internal roles became redundant. McKinsey, after decades of growth, began cutting deeply into its ranks. Other firms followed. AI didn't just threaten consulting work, it exposed the fragility of the value proposition. If machines could generate strategic outlines or financial models in moments, what were clients paying human consultants for? For a business built on insight, this wasn't inconvenient, it was existential. And as technology advanced, the industry's greatest asset, its ability to attract top talent, began slipping away. For decades, consulting's greatest strength wasn't its methodology, frameworks, or client lists. It was its people. The industry built its reputation on attracting the most ambitious graduates from top universities, analysts who worked long hours, learned quickly, and projected intellectual rigor. That pipeline powered every polished deck and high-stakes recommendation. But AI didn't just automate tasks, it disrupted the motivations that once drew those high achievers. Suddenly, the skill set consulting celebrated, rapid analysis, structured problem solving, turning messy information into clean slides, was no longer exclusive. Tools could now do much of that work instantly. For young graduates, the trade-off became harder to justify. Why endure long hours and uncertain impact when tech, finance, engineering, or startups offered higher pay and more creative work? The prestige that once made consulting irresistible began to fade. A coveted badge of competence now looked like a demanding job with unclear purpose. Inside firms, teams shrank, promotions slowed, and training budgets tightened. Analysts competing with software, not just peers, faced unclear career paths. This created a feedback loop. As top talent drifted away, work quality suffered. As work suffered, so did reputation. Clients began noticing deliverables were templated, generic, or reliant on AI. Some realized their own teams often understood challenges better than consultants. In a field where branding and image carried value, this shift was destabilizing. Consulting relied on the belief that the brightest minds were behind the scenes, offering insight unavailable elsewhere. Without that belief, fees were harder to justify. By the time firms tried to rebuild prestige, tools were smarter, clients more informed, and the old asymmetry where consultants held information and executives paid for access was gone. The result, a fragile business model struggling to keep pace with a rapidly evolving world. The unraveling of the consulting industry isn't just about overpriced reports or misplaced confidence. It's about what happens when a business model relies on information asymmetry, knowing something the client doesn't or appearing to. For decades, that gap created prestige, premium billing, and an aura of expertise that justified decisions before they were even made. Every industry built on opacity faces the same turning point. A new technology arrives that makes outcomes easier to measure and knowledge easier to access. AI didn't just automate tasks, it exposed consulting's vulnerabilities. This doesn't mean consulting will disappear. Organizations still need outside perspectives, help with complex decisions, or guidance in unfamiliar territory. But the industry that thrived on reputation alone can't survive in its old form. The $4 million trash bin report wasn't just an embarrassing headline, it symbolized an era ending, an industry confronting the limits of its own mythology.